The morning sun peeked through the blinds of the Fox News studio as the production team buzzed around, preparing for another day of political coverage. The 2024 presidential race was heating up, and tensions were running high across America. Everyone could feel it, that electric charge in the air that only comes during the most contentious election seasons. Karoline Leavitt arrived early, as she always did. The young press secretary for the Trump campaign was known for her preparation and poise under pressure. At just 28 years old, she had already made a name for herself in political circles as someone who didn't back down, no matter how bright the spotlight. "Coffee?" asked Tom, one of the production assistants, extending a steaming cup. "Thanks," Karoline said with a smile, taking a quick sip before glancing at her notes one last time. She knew what she was about to say would create waves, but that was the point. In politics, making an impact was everything. The Fox across America. Studio was smaller than most viewers imagined, intimate almost, with its mood lighting and comfortable chairs arranged for conversation rather than confrontation. Jimmy Fallon, the host, was reviewing his questions when Karoline walked in. "Ready to make some news today?" Jimmy asked with a grin. "Always," Karoline replied confidently. The makeup artist made a few final touches, and a producer counted down from 5. The red light on the camera blinked on, and they were live to millions of homes across America. After the customary pleasantries and a brief discussion about the latest poll numbers, Jimmy leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "So, Karoline, there's been a lot of talk about Vice President Harris's policy positions lately. What's your take on how her campaign is presenting her to voters?" This was the opening Karoline had been waiting for. She took a breath and dove in. "What we're seeing is something really remarkable, Jimmy. The American people deserve to know this," she began, her voice clear and measured. "Just in the last week alone, the Harris campaign has completely changed course on several major policies." She counted off on her fingers, gaining momentum with each point. "They've walked back her position on Medicare for all. Why? Because they've realized it's not popular to threaten the private health insurance plans of everyday Americans." Jimmy nodded, encouraging her to continue. "Then there's fracking. We have video footage of Harris saying clearly that she wants to ban fracking. But now that she's the nominee, that position has magically disappeared." Karoline's eyes were alight with conviction. "Think about what that means for Pennsylvania, for all those energy jobs. They know it would sink her chances there, so they're pretending she never said it." The studio lights felt warmer as Karoline continued her methodical breakdown. "And the Green New Deal that would cost taxpayers trillions? Another position they're now distancing themselves from." She paused for effect. "It's a pattern, Jimmy. Literally every major public stance Kamala Harris has taken over the last several years, her campaign is now putting at arm's length." What Karoline didn't know was who else was watching. In homes, offices, and on phones across the country, her words were landing like thunderclaps, particularly in a certain Manhattan apartment. Outside the studio, the city was going about its business. Cars honked, people rushed to work, vendors set up their carts. But inside the media ecosystem, a storm was brewing. By the time the segment ended, social media was already lighting up. Clips of Karoline's appearance were being shared thousands of times per minute. Conservative commentators were amplifying her message with added flourishes. Bombshell, exposed, Harris campaign in crisis. At campaign headquarters, phones started ringing nonstop. Reporters wanted comments. Supporters sought reassurance. Opponents smelled blood in the water. One campaign advisor threw his phone down in frustration after watching the clip. "She's good," he admitted grudgingly. "Too good at spinning this." Back in the green room, Karoline checked her phone and saw the notifications pouring in. She allowed herself a small smile. This was just the beginning. Meanwhile, in a coffee shop not far from the studio, 2 older men in suits discussed what they'd just seen on the television mounted on the wall. "You think there's anything to it?" one asked, stirring his coffee. "Hard to say these days," the other replied with a sigh. "Everyone changes positions somewhat. Question is whether this is normal campaign evolution or something more." "Suppose—" "We'll find out," said the first man, turning back to his newspaper. What nobody could have predicted was how one particular viewer would react. George Conway, the conservative attorney whose opposition to Donald Trump had made him an unlikely hero to many Democrats, had been watching from his apartment, increasingly agitated with each word from Karoline. As a lawyer, Conway prided himself on precision, on facts and context. As he watched Leavitt lay out her case against Harris, something stirred inside him. A mix of professional indignation and personal frustration that would soon spill over into public view. He picked up his phone and started typing, then deleted it all. He paced around his living room, arguing with the television as if Karoline could hear him. "That's not the full story," he muttered. "You're removing all context." His phone kept buzzing with messages from friends sending him the clip, asking what he thought. Each notification felt like another push toward action. Outside his window, New York City continued its relentless pace, unaware that a new political drama was about to unfold. Traffic inched along the streets below. A group of tourists pointed at landmarks. An ambulance wailed in the distance. Conway looked down at his phone again. The clip of Karoline had now been viewed millions of times. The narrative was setting in. If someone didn't challenge it soon, it would calcify into accepted fact. He made his decision. Sitting down at his desk, Conway began drafting a response, not just to Leavitt's claims but to the entire framework she had constructed. His legal training taking over, he assembled his counterarguments methodically, point by point. What Conway didn't realize was that his response would trigger a chain of events that would draw both him and Karoline Leavitt into the center of the political storm, making their personal conflict a national spectacle that would reveal unexpected truths about the campaigns, the media, and the American political landscape itself. As night fell on the city, both Leavitt and Conway were unaware that their public confrontation was about to begin. A confrontation that would change both their lives and possibly even influence the presidential race itself. The afternoon light filtered through the large windows of George Conway's Manhattan apartment, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. The place was quiet, except for the constant ping of notifications from his phone, which he'd tossed onto the couch after watching Karoline Leavitt's appearance on Fox. George rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. His morning routine had been completely derailed. The coffee in his favorite mug had gone cold, forgotten during the broadcast. His plans to review some legal briefs were now the furthest thing from his mind. "This is getting out of hand," he muttered to himself, pacing back and forth in front of the television that was now muted but still showing political coverage. The ticker at the bottom of the screen was already quoting Leavitt's comments about Harris. His phone rang. It was David, his old law school friend who now worked as a political consultant. "You watching this circus?" David asked without preamble. "Hard to miss," George replied, his voice tight with frustration. "She's spinning a completely misleading narrative." "Welcome to campaign season," David said with a dry laugh. "But I'm guessing you're not just going to let this one slide." George paused by the window, looking down at the busy New York street below. People were going about their day, unaware of the political drama unfolding in real time across media platforms. A delivery guy on a bike weaved through traffic. An older couple walked hand in hand window shopping. Life went on. "You know," George said slowly, "there's a difference between normal campaign messaging and what's happening here. This goes beyond spin." "So what are you thinking?" David asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. George's gaze drifted to a framed photo on his bookshelf. It showed him outside the Supreme Court after his first case there years ago. That younger version of himself looked so certain, so committed to the idea that truth mattered in public discourse. "I think someone needs to set the record straight," he finally answered. "Just be careful," David warned. "You know how personal this can get." After hanging up, George checked his social media. Leavitt's clip had been shared thousands of times. The comments were a battleground of partisan reactions, with very little thoughtful analysis. Some people were already tagging him, asking for his response. His email pinged. It was a producer from MSNBC. "Available for comment on the Leavitt statements? We'd love to have you on tonight." George stared at the email for a long moment. Going on television meant escalating this significantly. Once he stepped into the fray, there would be no turning back. The doorbell rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was his lunch delivery, a sandwich he'd ordered before the whole morning went sideways. He thanked the delivery guy and left a generous tip, then brought the food to his desk but made no move to unwrap it. Instead, he opened his laptop and began typing out his thoughts, organizing his response to Leavitt's claims. As a lawyer, he instinctively approached this like a case. Establish the facts, provide context, address mischaracterizations. His phone rang again. This time it was his daughter. "Dad, are you okay? I just saw that Fox segment, and I know how you get about these things." George softened at her voice. "I'm fine, honey. Just deciding how to respond." "You know they're going to make it personal," she said with concern. "They always do." "Some things are worth speaking up about," he replied, though part of him wondered if he was trying to convince himself. After they hung up, George went to the kitchen and made a fresh cup of coffee. The familiar ritual helped clear his head. As the coffee brewed, he gazed at the refrigerator door, covered with family photos, reminders of a life beyond politics. Back at his desk, coffee in hand, George made his decision. He responded to the MSNBC producer, "I'll be there. Send me the details." He spent the next few hours refining his thoughts, checking facts and preparing for what would undoubtedly be a high-profile confrontation. The lawyer in him was meticulous, but there was something else driving him now, a sense of personal responsibility. He had positioned himself as someone who stood for truth in political discourse, regardless of party. If he stayed silent now, what did that say about his convictions? By late afternoon, George's phone was ringing nonstop. Word had gotten out that he was planning to respond to Leavitt. Friends called to offer support or caution. Political journalists reached out for comments. Even a few former colleagues from his law firm checked in, curious about his next move. One call in particular gave him pause. It was from a senior advisor to the Harris campaign. "We appreciate your support, George," the advisor said carefully. "But you don't need to fight this battle." "I'm not doing this for the campaign," George replied firmly. "I'm doing it because the public deserves better than misleading narratives." After hanging up, he wondered if he had made the right call. Was he being played for political purposes? Or was his response genuinely about principles? As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow across his apartment, George changed into a suit for his television appearance. He checked his reflection in the mirror, noticing the dark circles under his eyes. This wasn't just about one campaign statement anymore. It had become something more personal, a test of his own public identity. His driver texted that he was downstairs. George gathered his notes, took one last look around his apartment, and headed out. In the elevator down, a neighbor recognized him. "Saw you're taking on the Trump campaign again," the older man said with a nod of approval. "Good for you. Somebody's got to stand up for the truth." George thanked him with a tight smile, but inside he felt the weight of those expectations. This was the role he had created for himself, the conservative lawyer who wasn't afraid to criticize his own side when they strayed from facts. It had cost him relationships, even contributed to the end of his marriage. But he had always believed it was worth it. The car ride to the studio was quiet. He used the time to collect his thoughts, to remind himself why he was doing this. Outside, New York City was transitioning from day to night. Office lights were coming on in skyscrapers. Restaurant patios were filling up with early dinner crowds. The everyday rhythm of the city continued, a reminder that most people weren't consumed by these political battles. His phone buzzed with a news alert. Leavitt had posted a follow-up statement, doubling down on her claims and adding new ones. The situation was escalating before he'd even had a chance to respond. When the car pulled up to the television studio, a producer was waiting to rush him inside. The place was buzzing with activity, staff hurrying between offices, multiple shows, being prepped simultaneously. "You'll be on in 20 minutes, the producer told him, leading him to makeup. "We've got a live feed from Leavitt coming in as well." George stopped in his tracks. "Wait, she's going to be on too?" Not at the same time, the producer clarified. But she's provided a response to your upcoming appearance. That's how these things work now. Responses to responses before anyone has even spoken. As he sat in the makeup chair, George took a deep breath and centered himself. What had started as a single segment on Fox had rapidly evolved into a political storm with him at the center. The makeup artist worked quickly. "Big night, huh?" she said conversationally. "Bigger than I expected," George admitted. A few minutes later, he was being led to the set. The lights were bright, the atmosphere tense with anticipation. As he was mic'd up, George could see the screen showing what was currently airing, clips of Leavitt's morning appearance followed by teasers about his upcoming response. The stage was set for a confrontation that would captivate political audiences across America. What neither George Conway nor Karoline Leavitt could have anticipated was how their personal battle was about to become a pivotal moment in the campaign, and perhaps in their own lives as well. The studio lights felt unusually hot as George Conway adjusted his tie one last time before going live. Behind the cameras, producers spoke in hushed, urgent tones, their eyes flicking between monitors. This wasn't just another political segment. It had become the story of the day. "We're on in 30 seconds, the floor director announced, holding up fingers to count down. George took a sip of water, his throat suddenly dry. He'd been on television countless times before, but tonight felt different. The stakes seemed higher, more personal somehow. "And we're back," said the host, Rachel, turning to face him with a practiced smile. Joining us now is attorney George Conway, who has some strong thoughts about claims made earlier today by Trump campaign press secretary Karoline Leavitt regarding Vice President Harris's policy positions. "George, thanks for being here," the EO. Red light on the camera blinked on and George leaned forward slightly. "Thanks for having me, Rachel. What we saw this morning was troubling, not just as campaign rhetoric, but as a fundamental mischaracterization of how policy works in real life." His words came out more forcefully than he'd planned. George noticed Rachel's eyebrows raise slightly. She could tell this wasn't going to be his usual measured legal analysis. "Let's break down what Ms. Leavitt actually said," George continued, finding his rhythm. She claimed that Harris is, quote, "walking back positions on healthcare, energy policy, and climate initiatives." But that framing deliberately ignores how policy evolves in response to changing circumstances, expert input, and yes, voter feedback. That's not flip-flopping. That's good governance. Rachel nodded. "So you're saying there's a difference between abandoning principles and refining policy details?" "Exactly," George replied, warming to his subject. "Harris isn't running from her record. She's adapting to a national campaign that requires nuance, something the Trump campaign seems fundamentally incapable of understanding." In a small conference room at Trump campaign headquarters, Karoline Leavitt was watching the segment on a wall-mounted television, surrounded by campaign staffers. The room had that distinct campaign office feel: takeout containers on the table, poster boards with messaging points on the walls, people typing furiously on laptops. "He's coming after you directly," said Rob, one of the communications directors, his eyes not leaving the screen. Karoline nodded, her expression unreadable. "Let him talk. He's only making our point for us." On screen, Rachel was pressing Conway further. "What about Leavitt's specific claim about the fracking ban statement? That seems pretty straightforward." George shook his head. "Context matters. What Harris said years ago was in response to a very specific question about new fracking on federal lands. The campaign isn't walking that back. They're clarifying an already nuanced position that Leavitt deliberately stripped of all context." He leaned forward, his voice taking on an edge that surprised even him. "When you have a press secretary making sweeping claims without context, you're not serving the public. You're serving a narrative. And the American people deserve better." Back in the campaign conference room, phones started buzzing. Social media was lighting up with Conway's comments. "We need to respond," said another staffer, looking up from his phone. "This is getting traction." Karoline stood up, straightening her jacket. "I'll do it myself. Get me a camera." Within 20 minutes, Karoline was standing in front of the campaign backdrop, a phone set up to record her direct response. She took a moment to gather her thoughts, then nodded to the staffer recording. George Conway's emotional outburst tonight proves exactly what we've been saying all along, she began, her voice calm but firm. When you can't defend the actual policy flip-flops, you attack the messenger. Notice that Conway didn't actually deny that Harris has changed her positions. He just tried to spin it as evolution and nuance. She smiled slightly. The American people aren't fooled by fancy lawyer talk. They know when someone is trying to hide their real agenda. As Karoline's response hit social media, George was leaving the MSNBC studio. His phone buzzed with a text from David, his friend from earlier. You didn't hold back, already trending. Check your Twitter. George sighed as he slid into the back seat of a waiting car. Take me home, please, he told the driver, then pulled out his phone. The notifications were overwhelming. Thousands of likes, shares, comments. His name was trending nationwide. He scrolled through some of the reactions, feeling a complex mix of vindication and weariness. Then he saw Karoline's response video, already racking up views. He hit play, watching her confident delivery with a grudging respect for her media skills, even as he disagreed with every word. The next morning, both Conway and Leavitt woke up to find themselves the top story across political media. Their exchange had taken on a life of its own, becoming a proxy battle for the larger campaign themes. George's phone rang as he was making coffee. It was a producer from CNN. We'd like to have you on to discuss the ongoing exchange with Leavitt, the producer said eagerly. She's already agreed to join for a separate segment. George hesitated. This isn't about me and Leavitt. It's about honest political discourse. Of course, the producer agreed too quickly. But viewers are fascinated by this back and forth. Ratings were through the roof last night. After hanging up, George stared out his kitchen window at the morning light on the neighboring buildings. What had started as a principled response was morphing into political entertainment. Was he helping to clarify the issues, or just adding to the noise? Meanwhile, in her apartment across town, Karoline was also fielding media requests while preparing for a campaign strategy meeting. Her phone rang with a call from the campaign manager. You've got the former president on the line, he said, his voice tense with excitement. He saw your response to Conway and wants to talk to you directly. Karoline straightened up immediately. Put him through. The conversation was brief but energizing. The former president loved her forceful response and wanted her to keep the pressure on. You're a star, he told her. Keep hitting back harder. By midday, the Conway-Leavitt exchange had evolved into a full-blown media narrative. Cable news ran split-screen graphics with their photos. Political analysts dissected their words like sports commentators breaking down a championship game. Late-night comedy shows were already writing jokes about it. At a local diner in Washington, two longtime political reporters sat in a booth, discussing the situation over lunch. What do you make of this Conway-Leavitt thing? Asked the first reporter, stirring her coffee. The older reporter chuckled. Been covering politics for 30 years. What we're seeing is as old as politics itself. Genuine disagreement amplified by personal chemistry and media attention. Though I have to say, both of them seem to really believe what they're saying. You think there's something personal about it? Asked the first reporter. There always is, the older reporter replied. Politics is human. Behind all the talking points and strategy, it's just people fighting for what they believe in, or what they've convinced themselves they believe. That afternoon, George received an unexpected call from a former colleague who now worked in Harris's campaign. You've certainly stirred things up, his colleague said. Just checking. Are you coordinating with us on this? Because if you are, we need to disclose it. Absolutely not, George replied firmly. What I said reflects my own views, not campaign. Talking points. Good to know, his colleague said. For what it's worth, you made some points we wish we'd articulated ourselves. After hanging up, George smiled ruefully. He'd become an unwitting surrogate for a campaign he had no official connection to. Politics made for strange alliances. That evening, both Conway and Leavitt found themselves booked on competing cable. news shows in the same time slot. As they prepared in separate studios, each wondered how this unexpected public confrontation would play out, and what impact it might have on the larger political landscape. In green rooms across Washington, makeup artists applied powder, and producers checked microphones. In campaign offices, staffers monitored social media and prepared rapid responses. And in homes across America, viewers tuned in, drawn by the promise of political drama playing out in real time. What had begun as a policy disagreement had transformed into compelling human theater, a clash of personalities and worldviews that revealed as much about American political culture as it did about the candidates themselves. As the cameras prepared to roll once again, neither George nor Karoline could have predicted how their confrontation would continue to evolve, or what surprising revelations still lay ahead. By the next morning, the Conway-Leavitt feud had taken over the political news cycle completely. People who had never paid much attention to campaign press secretaries or political commentators were suddenly fascinated by the unfolding drama. Morning shows played clips of both figures side by side. Radio hosts invited callers to weigh in. Social media platforms created special hashtags to track the developing story. In a small coffee shop in downtown Washington, three friends huddled around a shared phone, watching the latest clips. "I've never seen Conway this fired up," said one, a college student with glasses. "Usually he's all legal talk and footnotes." "Leavitt's holding her own, though," replied his friend, stirring sugar into her latte. "Most people would crumble under this kind of attention." The third friend shrugged. "Am I the only one who thinks they're both enjoying this a little too much?" Their conversation mirrored thousands of others happening across the country, as ordinary people found themselves unexpectedly invested in a political confrontation that seemed to capture something essential about the divided state of American politics. At CNN headquarters, producers gathered for the morning meeting, laptops open and coffee cups scattered across the conference table. The executive producer stood at the front of the room, reviewing the day's coverage plans. "Obviously, Conway-Leavitt is our lead story," she said. "We've got requests into both camps for exclusive interviews. In the meantime, we need panel discussions, social media reaction segments, and historical context. Has anything like this happened before?" A young producer raised his hand. "I've been looking into it. There have been press secretary feuds in the past, but nothing quite like this, where someone outside the campaign with Conway's profile goes directly after a press secretary this way. It's breaking new ground." "That's our angle, then." The executive producer nodded. "Political norms being broken. Get me experts who can discuss what this means for campaign discourse going forward." Across town, the atmosphere at Fox News was equally charged. In a glass-walled office, producers and hosts debated how to frame the ongoing story. "Leavitt landed a solid punch with those policy flip-flops," said one host, leaning back in his chair. "We should keep hammering that point." "But Conway's response is the real story now," countered a producer. "He's made himself the story, which takes attention away from Harris's actual record." "So we make that the point," suggested another host. "Conway's interference is a distraction tactic." Meanwhile, in New York, George Conway was trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. He decided to go into his law office, hoping work might provide a refuge from the political storm. It didn't. As he walked through the office, colleagues stopped to watch him pass. Conversations hushed, then resumed in whispers after he'd gone by. When he reached his office, he found a stack of message slips on his desk, calls from every major news outlet in the country. His assistant knocked lightly on the open door. "Your phone hasn't stopped ringing," she said, "and there are camera crews set up outside the building." George sighed, looking out his window. Sure enough, satellite trucks lined the street below. "Thanks," he said. "Hold all calls unless it's family." Once alone, he checked his email to find an invitation to appear on the most-watched late-night talk show that evening. The subject line read, "Exclusive, your side of the story." George shook his head in disbelief. How had a principled objection to campaign messaging turned into this media circus? More importantly, was any of it actually helping voters understand the issues at stake? At the same time, at Trump campaign headquarters, Karoline Leavitt was experiencing her own version of sudden fame. As she walked into the campaign office, staffers broke into applause. "There she is," called out a young volunteer. "The Conway. Slayer?" Karoline smiled but waved away the attention. "Back to work, everyone. This isn't about me." In a private office, she met with the campaign's senior communications team. Wall monitors displayed coverage of the Conway feud across multiple networks. Data analysts had prepared reports showing social media engagement numbers, all off the charts. "The numbers don't lie," said the digital director, scrolling through graphs on his tablet. "This is driving more engagement than anything we've done in months. People are actually paying attention to policy details that they would normally ignore." "But is it helping us?" Karoline asked, ever focused on the bigger picture. "Are we moving voters or just creating entertainment?" "Both, actually," replied the campaign's polling expert. "Our overnight tracking shows a slight bump in voter interest. Among independents, they're tuning in for the drama but staying for the substance of your arguments about Harris's changing positions." Karoline nodded, taking this in. What had started as a standard press appearance had somehow tapped into something larger. A hunger among voters for authentic conflict over substantive issues. By midday, the story had evolved yet again. Cable news producers, desperate to keep the narrative fresh, began booking former colleagues of both Conway and Leavitt to provide insider perspective on their personalities and working styles. On MSNBC, a former law partner of Conway's described him as always principled, even when it cost him personally. On Fox, a former congressional staffer who had worked with Leavitt called her fearless and deeply committed to truthful communication. What neither network managed to book was what viewers most wanted to see: Conway and Leavitt in the same room, face to face. "We're offering primetime, full hour, any format they want," said a frustrated booking producer at CNN, hanging up after another failed attempt. "Both camps say they're open to it in theory, but neither will commit to details." The truth was more complicated. Both Conway and Leavitt understood that the anticipation of a direct confrontation was more powerful than any actual debate could be. Reality rarely lives up to expectations, and both were experienced enough in media dynamics to know this. As evening approached, the story took yet another turn when several campaign surrogates from both sides appeared on panels together, turning the Conway-Leavitt proxy war into something broader. A debate about authenticity in politics and how policy positions evolve over time. On PBS NewsHour, a political science professor tried to provide perspective. "What we're witnessing is fascinating, a moment where process becomes substance. The debate about how campaigns communicate has become as important as what they're communicating." Back in his apartment that evening, George ordered takeout and tried to catch up on legal work he'd neglected. His phone kept buzzing with texts, from friends and colleagues, most offering support, some questioning his judgment. One text from a former White House colleague caught his attention. "You've opened a door neither campaign can close now. Hope you're ready for what comes next." George stared at this cryptic message, wondering exactly what it meant. He turned on the television, flipping between news channels, all still discussing the story from different angles. It was surreal to see his own face on screen, to hear pundits psychoanalyzing his motivations. In her own apartment across town, Karoline was experiencing a similar sense of disconnect. She'd done dozens of interviews and appearances over the past year, but none had created this kind of sustained reaction. As she prepared talking points for tomorrow's interviews, her phone lit up with a news alert. Developing. Internal campaign documents shed new light on Harris policy positions at AO. Center of Conway-Leavitt feud. Karoline's heart raced as she clicked the link. Someone had leaked internal campaign strategy memos to the press, documents discussing how to position Harris's evolving policy stances. The reporter hadn't published the full memos yet, just a teaser about the upcoming story. Who leaked them? What exactly did they show? Would they vindicate her claims or support Conway's interpretation? The questions swirled in her mind as she immediately dialed the campaign's crisis response team. Across the city, Conway was getting the same news alert. His first instinct was legal. Those documents might be protected by various privileges. His second thought was more personal. What if they showed he had misunderstood or mischaracterized something? As night fell on Washington, both Conway and Leavitt found themselves waiting anxiously for the next development in a story that had spiraled far beyond either of their expectations. What had begun as a policy disagreement had evolved into a national conversation about political authenticity, media dynamics, and the nature of public discourse. And somewhere in newsrooms across the country, reporters were poring over leaked documents that promised to add yet another dramatic chapter to the unfolding story. One that might finally reveal who was right, who was wrong, and what it all meant for the presidential campaign and the country. The morning newspapers landed with a thud outside doors across Washington, each featuring front-page stories about the leaked campaign documents. Online news sites crashed from traffic surges as readers rushed to learn what the documents actually revealed. The hashtag Conway Leavitt truth was trending nationwide before most people had finished their first cup of coffee. In a downtown hotel conference room, hastily converted into a temporary newsroom, the journalist who had broken the story was giving interviews to her own colleagues. The documents show something more nuanced than either side has been claiming, she explained, pointing to highlighted sections on a printout. There's evidence that the Harris campaign did refine certain policy positions, but the context reveals a more complex picture than simple flip-flopping. The documents, a series of internal strategy memos dating back several months, showed policy discussions among senior advisors. They revealed genuine debates about how to present Harris's views on healthcare, energy, and climate initiatives to a national audience without compromising her core principles. George Conway was sitting on the edge of his couch, television on, mute, reading through the full document leak on his laptop. His expression shifted between vindication and thoughtfulness as he scrolled through page after page. His phone rang. It was David, his friend who had warned him about getting involved. In the first place, "So does this make you right or wrong?" David asked, skipping any greeting. George laughed softly. "Both, I think. The campaign did adjust their messaging, which is what Leavitt claimed, but the documents show they were trying to clarify complex policies for voters, not abandon their principles. So everyone's a little right and a little wrong," David said. "How very un-2024. Across town, Karoline Leavitt was having a similar conversation with her campaign team, gathered in a conference room with empty coffee cups and half-eaten breakfast sandwiches scattered on the table. "These memos confirm exactly what I said," Karoline insisted, tapping her finger on a printed page. "They literally discuss how to reframe and adjust her position on fracking." "Yes, but look at this section," countered a senior advisor, pointing to another paragraph. "It talks about maintaining her commitment to clean energy while acknowledging energy security concerns. That's not abandoning principles, it's adding nuance." Karoline sat back, taking this in. "So what's our response?" "That's what we need to figure out," said the communications director. "We could double down or we could acknowledge the complexity. The question is, what serves our campaign goals better?" By midday, something unexpected was happening across news and social media platforms. Instead of the leaked documents simplifying the narrative into clear winners and losers, they had actually sparked more thoughtful discussions about policy evolution, campaign messaging, and political authenticity. On one cable panel, a political strategist who had worked on campaigns for both parties offered a refreshing take. "What these documents really show is how the sausage gets made. Campaigns have to translate complex policy positions into digestible messages. That's not deception, it's communication." At a popular lunch spot near the Capitol, a group of congressional staffers from both parties found themselves huddled around the same table, scrolling through news coverage on their phones. "My boss says this whole thing actually helped voters understand policy better than any debate could have," said one staffer, taking a bite of her sandwich. "Mine too," said another staffer from across the aisle. "People tuned in for the drama, but ended up learning about healthcare policy details they would have ignored otherwise." A third staffer laughed. "So Conway and Leavitt accidentally did a public service by fighting so publicly?" By late afternoon, both George Conway and Karoline Leavitt had received invitations to appear on a special primetime news special. Together, side by side, to discuss what the documents revealed and what they had learned from the experience. After some hesitation, both agreed. The stage was set for a finale to their very public confrontation. The television studio buzzed with anticipation. Producers spoke urgently into headsets. Makeup artists made final touches. The host, a respected journalist known for fairness, reviewed his notes one last time. When Conway and Leavitt finally met in person backstage, the moment was less dramatic than everyone had anticipated. "Ms. Leavitt," George said with a polite nod. "Mr. Conway," Karoline replied, extending her hand, which he shook briefly. They stood in awkward silence for a moment before George spoke again. "Quite a week," he said with a small smile. "That's one way to put it," Karoline agreed, returning the smile despite herself. Once on air, sitting across from each other with the host between them, both maintained their core positions but with noticeably less personal animosity. The documents confirm that the campaign adjusted their presentation of the vice president's policies, Karoline stated firmly. "Voters deserve to know when that happens." "I don't disagree with that," George replied, surprising viewers and the host alike. "Transparency is essential. My objection was to the characterization that policy evolution equals abandoning principles." The host leaned forward. "So, are you two finding some common ground here?" Both looked uncomfortable with that framing. "Let's not go that far," George said with a dry laugh. "We still have fundamental disagreements about policy substance." "Absolutely," Karoline added quickly. "But perhaps we can agree that policy discussions benefit from context and nuance, even in campaign messaging." As the segment continued, viewers witnessed something rare in modern political discourse. Two opponents acknowledging the complexity of the issues while maintaining their distinct perspectives. When the show ended and the cameras stopped rolling, both Conway and Leavitt received messages from their respective sides, some supportive, some critical of any perceived concessions. What neither side fully appreciated was how their confrontation had shifted the broader campaign conversation. For a brief moment, substantive policy discussions had broken through the usual campaign noise. Polls showed that voter awareness of key policy differences between the candidates had actually increased during the week-long media frenzy. The next morning, a major national newspaper ran an analysis piece with the headline, "Conway Leavitt, Feud Accidentally Makes Elections About Policy Again." In his apartment, George read the article while drinking his morning coffee. He smiled slightly at one paragraph. In an era of sound bites and social media, it took a personal confrontation to make Americans pay attention to the details of healthcare and energy policy. Perhaps there's a lesson here for how we cover campaigns. Across town, Karoline was reading the same article in her campaign office. She paused on a different section. Both Conway and Leavitt emerged with enhanced public profiles. More importantly, they inadvertently created a space for nuanced policy discussion. In a campaign season typically dominated by personality, in the weeks that followed, both returned to their respective corners. Conway continued his commentary, though with perhaps a bit more acknowledgement of political realities. Leavitt maintained her role as a fierce campaign defender, though occasionally with more context around policy claims. Neither would ever admit publicly that the other had any valid points. But privately, both had gained something from the experience, a first-hand understanding of how political communication affects public understanding, for better or worse. As the campaign continued toward Election Day, the Conway-Leavitt incident, as it came to be known, became a case study in political communication courses. Students analyzed how a confrontation intended to score political points had accidentally created a rare moment of substantive policy discussion. Some cynics dismissed it as a brief anomaly in an otherwise personality-driven campaign. Others saw it as a small but meaningful example of how political discourse could potentially improve, through passionate but substantive disagreement focused on real issues affecting voters' lives. One evening, weeks later, George Conway found himself at a Washington restaurant and spotted Karoline Leavitt at a distant table with campaign colleagues. Their eyes met briefly across the room. Neither smiled or waved, but there was a moment of recognition, an acknowledgement of the unexpected journey they had taken together in the public eye. A waiter approached Conway's table. "The gentleman at the bar sent this over," he said, placing down a drink. "He said to tell you thanks for making politics interesting again, even if just for a week." Conway looked over at an older man raising his glass in salute, a former political reporter he recognized from past interviews. Meanwhile, at her table, Karoline was showing her colleagues something on her phone. New polling data indicating that voters were paying more attention to policy details than in previous election cycles. "Look at these numbers on voter awareness of the healthcare plan differences," she said. "They're way up from last month." "The Conway effect?" one colleague asked with a smirk. Karoline shook her head, but couldn't entirely suppress a smile. "Let's just call it an unexpected outcome." As both Conway and Leavitt continued their roles in the ongoing campaign drama, neither could have predicted how their confrontation would influence countless dinner-table conversations across America, where families and friends were now discussing policy details that would have otherwise gone unnoticed. In living rooms, workplaces, and online forums, people were asking better questions and demanding more substance from political coverage. It wasn't a revolution in political discourse, just a small shift toward substance over spectacle. But, in an age of sound bites and shallow engagement, even a small shift toward meaningful debate was something worth noting. And it had all started with a press secretary making claims, a lawyer taking exception, and a political system that turned their disagreement into national theater, accidentally creating a moment of clarity amid the campaign chaos.